during that while we're working through things. All right, hello to our friends joining us via recording. During today's class, we are going to be focusing on the spinal cord, as well as the nerves that come off it and the bones and muscles that we see in the back. Now, here's a quick review of something we're going to talk a little bit more about in lecture today. When we look at the brain and we compare the brain to the spinal cord, they have the same kinds of tissue in them, meaning that they have both gray matter and white matter, like we see in these pictures. But the locations of the gray matter and the white matter are different in the brain compared to the spinal cord. So in the brain, we find our gray matter on the outside of the spine of the brain, and the spinal cord, we actually find the gray matter in the very middle. When we're talking about gray matter, this is the part of the brain or the spinal cord that does not have as much myelin in it. So having myelin makes the tissue look white. So when we're thinking about the parts of the brain that are darker in color, my gray matter that I see here, that's going to be my processing parts of the brain. When we're thinking about the stuff that's lighter in color, that helps me to send messages quickly. So it's the same deal with the spinal cord. When we're thinking about processing information, that's done in the gray matter. When we're thinking about sending information up or down very quickly, that's done in the white matter of the spinal cord. When we're talking about the spinal cord, just like when we talked about the brain, we have connective tissue membranes that are wrapping around the spinal cord to keep it safe. The names of these membranes should look very familiar to you because they are exactly the same as they were with the brain. And they're actually literally connected to these layers that we see around the brain as well. So the innermost connective tissue layer that wraps around the spinal cord is called the Pia Mater, just like that connective tissue layer that wrapped around the brain. On the outside of the Pia Mater is my intermediate layer called the Arachnoid Mater. Remember that the Arachnoid Mater is the layer that looks like spider webs, the Arachnoid Mater. And the outermost layer, the thickest layer, is called the Dura Mater. Each of these layers attach to the same layer on the brain. So our meninges are continuous from your brain all the way down to your spinal cord. When we look inside the spinal cord and look at a cross section of it, we can see a lot of different and very important markings. The first thing I want to label with you, and I want all of us to underline, highlight, star this, underline, highlight, star dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. Every time you look at a spinal cord model, the absolute first thing you must locate is the dorsal root ganglion. So when I'm looking at my model here, the dorsal root ganglion is this bump I see right here, number 24. I can see it on this side as well, number 24. The reason I must find the dorsal root ganglion at the very beginning is because the dorsal root ganglion helps me to tell the difference between the dorsal side, which is the back side, and the ventral side, which is the front side. So this is the dorsal side, the back side of my spinal cord, because it's the side that has that dorsal root ganglion. The word ganglion just means a bump. So the dorsal root ganglion is the bump that I find on this structure, this line of neurons that comes together that makes up the dorsal root. So the dorsal root is the group of neurons that's going into the back side, the dorsal side of the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion is the bump that's on that root. When I send information into the spinal cord and it's coming off of that root, the first place it goes is into my dorsal gray horn. So my dorsal gray horn is the group of gray matter that's on the back side, the dorsal gray horn. We're doing a dorsal motif, if you will. We're doing all the things that start with dorsal. When we're talking about the kinds of neurons that live in different parts of the spinal cord, the kind of neuron that lives in the dorsal gray horn are neurons called interneurons. Interneurons. And if you remember from our discussions last week, interneurons are my processing neurons. So the neurons that I find back here in my spinal cord, these are the processing neurons. For them to be able to process information, they have to have received information somehow, and that's the job of the neurons that live in the dorsal root and in the dorsal root ganglion. My sensory neurons are found traveling through the dorsal root. Their cell body actually lives in the ganglion. So we'll see in a moment on a picture, remember our unipolar neurons. That's why I've got a bump here, because of all their cell bodies that live out here in the dorsal root ganglion. Once I process information in the dorsal gray horn, then I need to send that information, decide what I'm supposed to do with it, and send that out of the spinal cord. So one of the ways I send that out of the spinal cord is using neurons from up here. The neurons that are up here are part of what's called the ventral gray horn. If I'm talking about the ventral gray horn, the one that's on the front, the ventral gray horn has neurons that control skeletal muscles that help you with doing conscious movements, for example. So all of the major muscles in your body that we're moving get their directions from the ventral gray horn. We also, though, need to be able to control smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. And my motor neurons who control smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, those live in what's called the lateral gray horn. So if I decide when I'm processing that what I need to do is I need to move my hand to take notes, that would be the job of a neuron that lives in the ventral gray horn. But if I decide after processing that what I need to do is I need my heart to beat faster, that would be the job of my lateral gray horn neurons. So different kinds of neurons that live in these two places. That being said, both of them let their information leave the spinal cord using this structure that's up here. This structure up here is called the ventral root. The ventral root. Just like we had the dorsal root that went into the backside, the ventral root comes from the front side. The ventral root has motor information. So it only has motor information because it's taking the information from the neurons that lived in the ventral horn or the lateral horn away from the spinal cord. When we talk about the dorsal root, what we labeled back here is sensory, those neurons are going into the spinal cord. So the information's direction is a little bit different, going in to the back, going out of the front. But the place where those two roots come together to form one solid structure, like we see here, this one solid structure that's a mixture of my dorsal root and my ventral root, that's a spinal nerve. So a spinal nerve has both sensory and motor in it, but we have to send sensory information toward the back of the spinal cord, and motor information comes off the front of the spinal cord. A few things that we have left. The first group of things that we have left are what we call the dorsal median sulcus. Remember that a sulcus is an indentation. The dorsal median sulcus is the one on the back side. Ooh, I lost my pointer. There it is. So the dorsal median sulcus is an indentation on the back side. The ventral median fissure, a fissure is also an indentation or an open space It's larger on the ventral side, on the front side. The last thing on our list is called the white matter funiculi. In lecture today, we're going to talk about another word for funiculi, and that other word we're going to use is tracts. Tracts are groups of neuron axons that all travel together in the same direction. So the white matter funiculi literally fill everywhere in the white matter. So when you get this question on the homework assignment, you can click in any of the places where there's white matter, because everywhere in the spinal cord where I have white matter, I've got groups of neurons either running up or running down. So the white matter funiculi are everywhere in the white matter. That's just the axons of my neurons sending information up or sending information down. Let me pause for a moment, give you a chance to make sure you've caught up with me, and pose any questions that you have in the chat. Or give me a thumbs up if you're feeling good. Yeah, Lisa said she's glad I'm recording. Oh, absolutely. We'll get this posted for you either tonight or tomorrow morning. I can't do it on campus, but I can do it from my computer at home. So I will get it out to you very soon. All right, well, with us labeling this one all the way, I'm not going to label all the parts of our other models, but I am going to highlight some things that maybe we can see a little bit better on various ones. So one of the things that we hadn't seen up until this point is this circle thing right here. See this dot that I have in here? That circle thing, that dot that we're seeing, that is the central canal. That is the middle part of the spinal cord where we have cerebrospinal fluid. So the central canal in the very middle of the spinal cord, cerebrospinal fluid found there. Other than that, I'll point out a couple of other things. Remind me, I told you we always have to look for this bump. Do we remember what the initials are for this bump? I will not make you type its whole name, but can we remember the name, the initials of the bump that lives back here? Yeah, Hayden's absolutely right. Lisa too. This is the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion. Remember, we have to find that every single time, because if I find that, then I know that back here is my dorsal horn. So I've got to know front side from back side. If I find the dorsal root ganglion, that'll give me my dorsal horn. That'll give me this whole structure here. All of this back here is the dorsal root. So we start with that dorsal root ganglion, where, remember, my sensory neurons live, to bring their information into that dorsal horn. We also have, if you notice, our lateral horn. Ooh, that color does not show up well. I'm going to color it. Lateral horn more on the side. Again, lateral horn more on the side. That was where my smooth muscle and cardiac muscle controllers were, in those parts. We also have in the front that ventral gray horn, the ventral gray horn in the front. So we had to be able to identify dorsal and ventral before we could do any of our labeling here. Again, I'll point out too, as a quick note, notice that my ventral median fissure is much wider than my dorsal median sulcus. So a good way to keep them straight is that the dorsal median sulcus is not as wide as the ventral median fissure. that we see here. One more model that I wanted to peek at with you. This model does a really good job of showing me the spinal nerves. So remember that the spinal nerves form when a dorsal root and a ventral root come together, my spinal nerves, when a dorsal root and ventral root come together. Again, I can see on this picture my big dorsal root ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion. So that helps me to know that this one is the dorsal horn. So I'll put a D for dorsal. Here's that ventral horn in the front and that lateral horn on the side. Remind me again, when I'm looking for funiculi, where did I find the funiculi on these models? How would I know where to click for the funiculi? Where are the funiculi? I promise it's not a trick question. About half of us are in class right now. A third of us are not paying attention to our computer screen, right? And then there's like a quarter of us that are just like not even around, right? Yeah, so Lisa's right, Samantha's right. Anywhere that there's white matter, anywhere we see white is going to be the funiculi, the white matter funiculi. So again, on the homework assignment, you can click anywhere. Anywhere that has the white matter, all of this is those funiculi. All of this is groups of neurons that are traveling up or traveling down. When I do processing, when I do predicting or letting messages out, that's the gray matter. But sending information up or down, that's the white matter. You have a place in your packet for you to draw a sketch of what slides look like that show us the spinal cord cross section. If we were in the classroom together, we would grab a spinal cord slide and you'd hold it up to the light or put it on your piece of paper. Our slide is big enough that we actually don't need a microscope for it. So I've got a couple of pictures here that I'm going to show you that represents what that would look like if we were in class together. So on this particular slide that we're looking at a picture of, notice that they do have this big mass along the back side. This big mass is called the dorsal root ganglion, that thing we're always looking for, which tells me that back here then, oops, I keep losing that pointer. Back here then is that dorsal side, the dorsal side. Notice that my labels on this are using the word posterior. Posterior is the same as dorsal. So if you see that in the guided lesson, it's exactly the same. So this is my dorsal horn here in the back because it's on the dorsal side. Notice that they're using the word anterior. We use the word ventral. It's the same. So the one that's in the front on the opposite side of that dorsal root ganglion. And then over on the side, that lateral horn. When you're looking at the spinal cord, when we're looking at the cross sections, the dorsal horn goes back closer to the edge of the spinal cord. The ventral horn doesn't quite make it there in the same way. Let me show you a couple of other pictures to highlight this. See how my dorsal horn on this one is going all the way back and touching the edge of the spinal cord. And the same deal here. My dorsal horn is going all the way to the back and touching the edge of the spinal cord. So the horns look a little bit different depending on where we are in the spinal cord, if we're in the neck or in the chest or down in the lower back. But everywhere that we're looking at in the spinal cord always has our dorsal horn, our ventral horn. We're always going to have that central canal, that open space for the cerebrospinal fluid in the middle. And we'll have, you can see really well in this one, my dividing line, my ventral median fissure, We can see on my other one that dorsal median sulcus as well as that ventral median fissure as well. So some slide pictures just to show you what it looks like in real life, not just on the models. I have a picture here that you do not have in your lab packet, but I'm going to use it to help us in our discussion of things called a ramus. So a dorsal ramus or a ventral ramus, we ask you to know about these structures. When we talk about a dorsal ramus or a ventral ramus, this word ramus means branch. So if you imagine that we've got a spinal nerve, so here's my spinal nerve. That spinal nerve is made out of a dorsal root that's sending sensory information into the spinal cord and a ventral root that's bringing motor information out. I mix those together to make a spinal nerve, but then some of that information goes toward the back side of the body and some of that information goes toward the front side of the body. So think of the spinal nerve kind of like the trunk of the tree. I have some roots that are going to go underground or that are going to go and attach to the spinal cord. And then I've got branches, my rami, that are going to come off of the spinal nerve and go out to the body. So the dorsal rami are going toward the back, the muscles of the back, collecting sensory information from the skin. The ventral ramus is going toward the front, controlling our organs and things like that. So you got some questions in your packet about the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. That's where my spinal nerve splits into a front half and a back half, the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. My only model that really shows those things is this one that we're looking at here. This model shows me the spinal cord inside a vertebra, and we're going to talk all about vertebra bone markings toward the end of our class today. But this particular vertebra, I'm going to type in the chat, it's called a cervical vertebra. A cervical vertebra. Using what you know about directional terms, can you tell me where in the body would we find a cervical vertebra? Where in the body do we have cervical vertebrae? Where's that regional term cervical? What does that mean? Yeah, exactly. Several of us chiming in, the cervical region is your neck. So when we're looking at the bones in the neck region of your body, there's two specific markings that we see on this model that show me this is a cervical vertebrae. Marking number one is what we see up here. This that we see up here is called a bifid spinous process. Bifid spinous process. That means that I have two parts of my spinous process that stick up, the bifid spinous process. All of my other vertebrae in the thoracic and the lumbar region, they only have one thing sticking out. So one part on their spinous process, that's everybody else. Two parts, that's my cervical vertebrae. The other thing that cervical vertebrae have, we're not making you label it on this picture, but you will label it later, is this region right here where you can see the blood vessels. And I've got it on this side as well. This region where I'm seeing the blood vessels, this is actually a hole inside my bones, and this is called the transverse foramen. Transverse foramen. Transverse foramen are special holes that we see on the two outside parts of our cervical vertebrae. This is a place for blood vessels to get up to the brain. So the reason I only have them in cervical vertebrae is because these are the only ones that are right next to the brain. So we put blood vessels in there that are going up into the head. Because I see those, and because I see the bifid spinous process, I can tell that this is a cervical vertebra. It's in the neck. We have labeled most of the things that are on here. I want to review a couple of new things for us. First, I'll mention that you can see right here my region that is the spinal nerve. So here's my spinal nerve, where I've got my dorsal root ganglion and my dorsal root that's merging with that ventral root down here. They come together to make that spinal nerve. I can see it over here as well. There's that spinal nerve. But now what I can see much better than I've seen on any of my other models is this right here. There's that dorsal ramus. There's that branch going toward the back, and I've got it over here too. There's that dorsal ramus going toward the back side of the body. And I can see the rest of what's left here is my ventral ramus. Ventral ramus. And again, I can see that on this side too. Ventral ramus. The other thing I want to make sure to label with you are the 3 meningeal layers that we see. So the connective tissue that wraps around the spinal cord. So when we're looking at what's wrapping around the spinal cord, let's start with the layer that's closest to the spinal cord. So I'm trying to color it green. Apologies, I know it's hard to see. If you go with numbers, it's number 24. So the connective tissue that's attached to the spinal cord, number 24, that connective tissue attached to the spinal cord is the Pia Mater. So the layer that's right on top of the spinal cord, the Pia Mater. Then we go out a little bit. They're calling it the red line, so I'm going to color it and make it red. The red line is my next layer of connective tissue. So number 11, the red line that I just colored red, that red line is the Arachnoid Mater. It's the next layer of connective tissue right there on the outside of the Pia Mater. And there is that subarachnoid space that we talked about around the brain. We have that around the spinal cord as well. We'll talk more about that in lecture next week. One last layer of connective tissue all the way on the outside. It's this thick one that's white. I think they had it labeled number 9 before I drew on top of it. So this thick layer, this thick white layer, that thick white layer is the dura mater, the dura mater. Remember that these layers are exactly the same as the layers we had around the brain. They go down and around the spinal cord as well. Something we will talk about more in lecture, but I'll mention it to you. Notice the space here called number 10. They labeled number 10 with all of that yellow adipose tissue in it and blood vessels in it. That's something, I'll type it in the chat, called the epidural space. So it's above the dura mater, the epidural space. We're going to talk about in lecture how that's the space where if a woman gets an epidural during childbirth, that's where the medication goes, into a little fat-filled space on the outside of the dura mater. So you don't have to label it here. We'll talk about it more in lecture, but on the outside of the dura mater. I believe that is it. Yep, on my cross sections. So let me pause for a moment and give you a chance to ask any questions. Or if you're good, shoot me an emoji. This will be more applicable later, but it's really cool, so I'm going to have to put it into the chat. Perfect. Lots of happy hand gestures, high fives, thumbs ups, rock ons. Cool. All right. then let's switch gears. So far, we've talked about looking at the spinal cord on the inside. Now we're going to look at the spinal cord big picture from the outside. When we look at the spinal cord big picture from the outside, first I'll grab my pointer just to show you. The spinal cord starts at the bottom of the medulla. So here's the medulla oblongata. So all of this is the spinal cord all the way down. The spinal cord doesn't go to the very end of the vertebral column. It stops around vertebrae L2 or L3-ish. So it's down in your lumbar region, in your lower back, that it stops. And we'll label this structure again later, but for your notes, if you'd like to label it, this region right here where the spinal cord ends, we call that Conus Medullaris. It's a cone-shaped thing at the end of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord goes from the medulla all the way down to L1, L2, and then it stops with the Conus Medullaris. There are a couple of places where the spinal cord is wider than normal. So I'm going to go to my zoomed in picture over here to highlight for us the first place where the spinal cord is bigger than usual. And that is this space right here. This space up here is called the cervical enlargement. Cervical enlargement. It's the place in the neck region and the cervical region where the spinal cord is wider because it has a lot more neurons there. Because see, those neurons that are in the spinal cord will leave and help me to form what we see out here. These are those brachial nerves. The brachial nerves going out to help me move my arms or collect information from my arms. Can you tell me in the chat, do we ask you to label the plexuses on this picture or no? I don't have my lab packet in front of me. Do we ask you to label like the, okay, no, perfect. Okay, so we'll skip that until we get to the next picture. We'll talk about the plexuses, but here's my little brachial nerves that are going out into the arm. Next door or above them, excuse me, we see our cervical nerves. So the ones that are in the neck region, cervical nerves. You can see all of these nerves that are down here in the chest. All of these are the thoracic nerves. Thoracic nerves that we see here. And we'll go down a bit to the lumbar and the sacral ones in just a moment. I think the only other thing that I'm going to mention to you up here is that we can see some cranial nerves. So the first cranial nerve we can see is up here at the top. That's cranial nerve number 1. Down below it, we've got that crisscross. That is cranial nerve number 2. We can also see cranial nerve number 6 pretty well. I promise you that I'm not going to ask you to identify all of the cranial nerves on here, but some of them are more obvious than others. So make sure we're remembering which nerves we can see on this picture. So let's go down. We stopped with our thoracic nerves that we see here. At the very end of the spinal cord is that thing we talked about before. Here's my cone-shaped end. So that's the thing called Conus Medullaris. Conus Medullaris. Because the spinal cord doesn't go all the way down to the very end of the vertebral column, I actually use a piece of connective tissue to attach it to the end. So I'm going to attempt to draw on it right here. There's a thin strip of connective tissue that goes all the way down. That thin strip of connective tissue is called the filum terminale. Filum terminale. The goal of the filum terminale is to make sure that your spinal cord doesn't move around in the vertebral column, so it kind of keeps it taut, or is like an anchor that holds it in place. But because the spinal cord itself doesn't go all the way to the end of the vertebral column, we have a bunch of nerves that come off of the conus medullaris that go all the way down. So all of these nerves that I'm drawing here in blue All of those are called the cauda equina. Cauda equina, that literally means horse's tail. The cauda equina is the group of nerves that travels down the rest of the vertebral column that helps us get messages out of the spinal column, even lower than that spinal cord itself goes. The other couple of things I'll mention here, just like we had a cervical enlargement, notice how this area got wider again. So this would be that lumbar enlargement, the place where the lower back gets larger as well. That's where all my neurons that are going into the legs are found. And then we have our lumbar nerves that are kind of in this area. So lumbar nerves. And our sacral nerves down lower, coming off of the sacrum. So sacral nerves down below as well. So when we look at the spinal cord as a whole, remember that it ends at the conus medullaris. We've got all of those little nerves going down called the cauda equina. Depending on whether they come out around the lumbar region or whether they're coming out around the sacrum, that's how we would decide if they are our lumbar nerves or sacral nerves, just like we had thoracic and brachial and cervical nerves. If we look at a different model, so I believe we flipped the page now for you all. We're now looking at our spinal nerves model, and this model shows me that once those spinal nerves leave the spinal cord, sometimes they make a big mess together, something called a plexus. So our plexuses are the places, if we look here on my model, see how we got a hot mess going on up here in the neck? That's my cervical plexus, where my nerves are not a straight line, where they're going in circles and up and down and branching all over the place. That's the cervical plexus. Right underneath the cervical plexus, all of this that I see here, that's my brachial plexus. Brachial plexus. We do not have a thoracic plexus. And if you look at those thoracic nerves, each of them are all by themselves. So that's how I know it's not a plexus. But then I get back down here into the lumbar region. Here's my lumbar plexus. And that goes down into the very bottom where we've got that sacral plexus. So everywhere along my spinal column, I have plexuses except in the thoracic region. Hey, the benefit of these plexuses, by the way, is if something were to happen, say I got in an accident and I damaged this nerve up here. If I didn't have a plexus, this would completely eliminate some part of my body from getting sensory or motor information. But because other nerves that are up here also share their neurons with the things that I formed down below, I still might have sensory or motor stuff, even if I damage one of my spinal nerves. So it gives us a kind of redundancy where there's more than one way for me to get information to places in the body where I need it to go. We are asking you to know some of the brachial plexus and lumbar and sacral plexus nerves. There is one cervical plexus nerve I'll mention. I'm not going to ask you about it, but you might find it interesting to know about. And that is a nerve called the Phrenic Nerve. Again, we're not going to ask you about it, but the Phrenic Nerve controls your diaphragm. So if you have hiccups, it can be because the Phrenic Nerve is firing sporadically. It's not firing like it should be. So I'm not going to ask you about the Phrenic Nerve. I'm not going to make you identify it, but I'll throw that out there because it's kind of fun, an explanation for us of hiccups. We do have to know several of our brachial plexus nerves, though. So let's look at those nerves. We're going to start up here in the shoulder. This nerve that I see up here in the shoulder on both sides, this nerve up here is called the axillary nerve. The axillary nerve. The axillary nerve can actually be damaged if you were to get a intramuscular injection that wasn't given quite right. If it was administered too deeply into your shoulder region, it could bump into the axillary nerve. Hey, we're asking you with these nerves to use their locations to predict what muscles they might control. When we talk about the axillary nerve, what muscle that we looked at last week, what muscle lives right on top of the axillary nerve? Who's up there? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in correctly that the muscle that lives on top of the shoulder is called the deltoid muscle. And in fact, that is the muscle that the axillary nerve controls. So if I know where the axillary nerve is, and I know where the deltoid muscle is, I can put those two things together. I can make that prediction. Hey, down below the axillary muscle, or the axillary nerve, excuse me, the next nerve that we're learning is this one right here. And again, I can see it over here. This nerve that I'm looking at over here is the musculocutaneous nerve. The well, let's see. I'm just going to type that in. Actually, it's over here. We're just going to do this. Musculocutaneous nerve. I am not going to write that with a mouse. The musculocutaneous nerve helps to collect sensory information from your arms. So that's the skin on your arms. That's the cutaneous part. The muscular part is referring to the fact that this is a nerve that helps us with contracting things like biceps brachii. So biceps brachii lives right by the musculocutaneous nerve, and it helps with its contraction. Then we get down into our nerves that are in the forearm. The good news is that they are named based on bones or based on the fact, for this one right here, based on the fact that it's in the very middle of the arm. So my middle nerve in the forearm is the median nerve. It's in the middle. And on either side of it, I've got a couple more nerves. Now help me out in the chat. This one right here is on the thumb side. Was it the radius or the ulna on the thumb side? Who lives on the thumb side? Exactly. Yep, my radius lives on the thumb side, which means that my nerve on the thumb side is the radial nerve. The radial nerve. Which means that my other nerve is the ulnar nerve that lives on the ulna side. That one's straightforward because the hand is facing the palm is facing towards you. Notice that over on my other arm, they've done what's called pronation. So the palm of the hand is facing away. Hey, but this is still my thumb side over here. So this is still the radial nerve. Still the radial nerve. And this over here is still the pinky side. This is still the ulnar nerve. I can see that median nerve up higher over here, median nerve. So the brachial plexus nerves either go into the arm or they go into the forearm, going down toward the finger. When we're talking about the lumbar and the sacral plexus nerves, these are all going either to the thigh or down into the lower leg. So when we're looking at the nerves that come off of the lumbar plexus, there's really two of them. So the first one is what we see right here, arching down in front of the femur. You can also see it over here, down in front of the femur. This is the femoral nerve. Imagine that, right? The femoral nerve. The other nerve that comes off of the lumbar plexus is this one that I see right here. And I see it on this side as well. This nerve that I see in the middle of the thighs is called the obturator nerve. The obturator nerve. The obturator nerve controls your adductor muscles. Remember that triangle-shaped muscle group that's there in the middle of your thigh? The adductor muscles. The obturator nerve controls those. Then we get down into the sacral plexus. When we are talking about the sacral plexus, the star player of the sacral plexus is the one I'm going to color on top of here. To quote a textbook, this is the largest and longest nerve in your body. So I can see it just a little bit here. The largest and longest nerve in your body is called the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve. And if you've ever known someone with sciatica, that's when the largest and longest nerve in your body gets angry. That's what sciatica is. So the sciatic nerve, the biggest nerve that comes out of the sacral plexus, this nerve splits in half. Half of it goes back behind the tibia. So this part that I'm seeing here back behind, that's the tibial nerve. Tibial nerve goes back behind. But the other half kind of wraps around the front. So I can see it here, but you can also see very clearly here that it's paralleling the fibula. So the fibular nerve on front, the tibial nerve on back. So the sciatic nerve branches into the tibial nerve and the fibular nerve. Any questions about identifying these nerves before we move on? Or if you're tracking with me, shoot me a thumbs up. All right, I like it. Got a couple of thumbs up. You're totally fine, Lisa. So as you are studying, I want you to use the guided lesson to help you fill in the next part of your packet, where we ask you to predict actions of various muscles. These pictures that I'm showing you here with their stars and their labels are in that guided lesson. So you can use that to help you figure out what muscles do these nerves control, or which parts of the body do they collect sensory information from. So that's our goal of learning the locations of these nerves, is to be able to make predictions like that, where we can decide who's getting sensory information from where, or what muscle is getting controlled by what nerve. So guided lesson will walk you through how to do that step by step. I want to briefly chat with you about the Reflex Arc Model, and then we're going to dive into muscles and bones. So this model should look familiar to us because we already labeled it previously for things like the sensory neuron, the motor neuron, and the interneuron. Now we can label a few extra things that we couldn't label before. So remember from the first time we labeled this that the yellow neuron was a sensory neuron, collecting sensory information. We're adding this week to our sensory neuron the fact that at the bottom of it, so down in this region here, you can see all of the receptors that we use to help our sensory neuron collect information. So the sensory neuron has receptors. They detect things like, oh, this pan is hot, or, oh, this is really bumpy. That information comes through my sensory neuron. It's going back into the spinal cord. And hey, look, on this model, we can see that bump. Again, what were the initials for that bump? Can you remind me? The one I always tell you we got to find. Time number 1 with our spinal cord. Yeah, exactly. We're never going to forget those letters, right? Dorsal root ganglion, DRG. The reason I have it is because of the cell body of the sensory neuron. We put all kinds of sensory neuron cell bodies here. That's why we've got that bump. So the sensory neuron cell bodies here in the dorsal root ganglion, that information comes into the spinal cord. We talk to the interneuron that's inside the spinal cord. The interneuron figures out what we should do and gives those directions to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron goes and talks to what we call the effector, the thing that gets the job done. So we will be talking more in lecture next week about reflexes. Reflexes are the ability of your body to get something done without your brain having to decide what to do. It makes things faster if we don't have to get the brain involved. And actually the fastest reflex in our body, I like to call it the kick your doctor reflex. So the patellar reflex, that one is super, super fast because we actually don't even have an interneuron in that reflex. It's so automatic that we detect stretching and right away we start to kick. So most of my reflexes in the body will have a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron, but that patellar reflex does not, which is what makes it super quick. So you've got a question about that one at the bottom of your reflex page. When we're thinking about the patellar reflex, no interneuron, no processing equals really fast. Hayden says that's his favorite part of doctor visits, getting the chance to kick your doctor, right? That's great. I always psych myself out too. I'm so bad at the patellar reflex because I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna relax. I'm just gonna relax, and then I like can't do it. So eventually I get there, but gotta let the reflex take charge. All right, with that, we're going to transition into bone markings and muscles and actions. So this week we're learning about the last set of bones in the body. These are the bones of the back. So when we're talking about the bones of the back, the first one for us to be familiar with is the scapula. When I'm talking about anterior versus posterior on the scapula, you need to imagine that you're standing in front of a person and you're looking straight through them. So if I look straight through them, the anterior side is what I would see touching their rib cage. The posterior side of the scapula is the side you can feel. So when you feel your shoulder blade, what you're actually feeling is this ridge right here. This ridge is called the spine of the scapula. At the end of the spine of the scapula is a big bump called the acromion. The acromion. And this is going to be very important for forming your shoulder joint. Your shoulder joint is the acromioclavicular joint, one of your joints there, where the acromion touches the clavicle. We can also see when we're looking at the posterior side, the side that you can feel, the fact that there are indentations above and below the spine. So this whole region that is an indentation below the spine is called the infraspinous process, infraspinous fossa. Sorry about that. Infraspinous fossa for an indentation. And the indentation above the spine is the supraspinous fossa. Supraspinous fossa. So two indentations above and below the spine of the scapula. The other marking we can see on the back side is this big indentation right here. This is called the glenoid cavity. The glenoid cavity, which is an indentation for the head of the humerus. This is how we build the shoulder joint, the glenoid cavity. We can see that glenoid cavity when we're looking through your chest, essentially. So there's that glenoid cavity over here. We can also see the acromion, which is what's left sticking up off of the spine. But the other thing that we can see when we're looking from the front view is there's another thing that sticks out. This other thing that sticks out here is called the coracoid process. Coracoid process. So that one sticks forward a little bit more, and that's an important one for muscle attachment, the coracoid process. Other than that, the one other thing to mention on the scapula is this big indentation that we see. That's the entire front side, essentially, of the scapula. This is called the subscapular fossa. Subscapular fossa. And that just means it's my indentation that's underneath the scapula. Because this is when we're looking at the scapula, remember, this is when I look straight through it, that's what I see. The flat surface where those ribs are rubbing against the scapula. Next, oh, one more view of that, sorry. We got our glenoid cavity here. Remember that the acromion is the marking in the back. And the coracoid process is the one on the front. This is the subscapular fossa. So the subscapular fossa, because this is the one that's pointing toward the front, that's touching the ribs. And I can see my spine all along here, my spine. Next set of bones for the week are the vertebrae. We should know from the top that we have 4 different kinds of bones that make up the vertebral column. So at the very top, we've got the cervical vertebrae, which we already talked a little bit about, the cervical vertebrae. Down below them, how do I keep doing this? I keep losing my pointer. Down below them, thoracic vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae. And the last set of vertebrae are called the lumbar vertebrae. The sacrum technically is a bunch of fused vertebrae down at the bottom, but we call them the sacrum as a whole. It's something like 3 to 5 vertebrae that all grew together to make the thing called the sacrum. When we're learning the vertebrae, generally speaking, we just need to know, is it a cervical vertebra, a thoracic vertebra, or a lumbar vertebra? The exception to that is the first 2 vertebrae that we have in the spine. So we need to know that the first cervical vertebra is called the atlas. That's the name of C1, the atlas vertebra. The name of C2, the second vertebra, that's the axis. So the axis and the atlas are the 2 vertebrae at the top of the vertebral column. They have their own names. The ways you're going to recognize them. When I'm trying to recognize the atlas, I'm going to look at these things right here. So these things right here are what we call the superior articular facets. Superior articular facets. These are the places where your skull literally sits on top of your vertebrae. So the superior articular facets allow you to nod your head forward and backward because they're of this indentation that allows it to rock back and forth. So if I see those 2 big flat surfaces on top of this vertebra, that is C1, that's the atlas. If I see this thing that sticks up, this is called the dens. If I see the dens, that is my way to know that I'm looking at the axis. I'm looking at the vertebra that I can use to turn the head left and right. So shake my head, no, the dens. All of my other cervical vertebrae are going to look like this. So the rest of my cervical vertebrae, let's mention the things we talked about before. Here's that bifid spinous process. bifid spinous process that sticks up. We can also see those transverse foramen that I have on both sides. The other bone marking we'll mention that literally every vertebrae has in it is this big hole right here. And I can see it over here, and I can see it over here. This big hole is called the vertebral foramen. Vertebral foramen. Not a trick question. What would I find inside the vertebral foramen? What's going to be inside here? Not a trick question. Yeah, exactly. In the very middle of each of my vertebrae, I have that space, the vertebral foramen, where I would find the spinal cord. So all of those horns that we labeled, the tracts, the meninges, all of that is inside these vertebral foramen, these big holes. Notice that all of my other vertebrae have these as well. So this is a thoracic vertebrae. There's my vertebral foramen. Draw a dividing line here. Here is my lumbar foramen with another, my lumbar vertebrae with another vertebral foramen. So that vertebral foramen is the hole for the spinal cord. When I look at my thoracic vertebrae on the left and my lumbar vertebrae on the right, one of the best ways to tell the difference between them is based on the shape of their spinous process. So notice how that spinous process is angled down and is very pointy, where this spinous process is maybe a little bit wider, not quite as long. So when I talk about the lumbar vertebrae, I like to call these the moose vertebrae. The moose vertebrae, because their spinous process sticks out like a moose face, and you can see some of their other attachment sites that are pretty large, kind of like a moose horn. Whereas when we look at the thoracic vertebrae, I like to call these ones the giraffe vertebrae. The giraffe, complete with those weird things they have on top of their head. So giraffe vertebrae are thoracic vertebrae. Moose vertebrae are lumbar vertebrae. If I'm looking from the top down, you'll also notice that this part here, called the body of a lumbar vertebra, is very wide and very thick, whereas the body on my thoracic vertebra isn't quite as large. We can also see on here some places where we would articulate with the ribs. So the thoracic vertebrae also articulate with the ribs, and that's something that makes them different. Any questions about vertebrae before we keep plugging on? Now's when I bring that GIF back, right? Let me find it. Ooh, another cool one. Check that out. Except that's probably giving you like PTSD from visible body, right? All too familiar. All right. Well, I'm not going to take time to match up all the joints for you. The one thing I do want to say, though, is when you see this beginning part right here that says atlanto, atlanto means the atlas. That's the specific name for the atlas vertebra. When we put it into a joint, we call it atlanto. So the ones where you're seeing atlanto, that's referring to the atlas. When we see acromio, that's that bone marking called the acromion. Or when we see gleno, that's that thing called the glenoid cavity that we labeled. So use context clues to help you match up these names. I want to briefly chat with you about the muscles that we see in the back. Please take advantage of the fact that this week there are so many muscles that you can also review. Because remember, our lab exam is in 2 weeks. So this view of Muscle Man, we can see so many different things. Take advantage of that as a chance to review, make sure we know stuff. So we talked about last week how my shoulder muscle was called the deltoid muscle. Deltoid muscle. Next to the deltoid muscle, we've got this large trapezoid shaped muscle. That's how it got its name. This big one here is trapezius. Trapezius. Down below trapezius, we've got this large one here along the back. This large one here along the back is called latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi. This bright pink one that I see right here, I'm going to go ahead and color it. This bright pink one that I'm looking at, this is called infraspinatus. Infraspinatus. It got its name because it is below the spine of the scapula, infraspinatus. And I'm going to switch colors to color in for us. This one over here. This one that I just colored in, teres major. So teres major, we can also see it right over here, teres major. There is also a teres minor. We're not making you learn that one, but we do need to be able to identify teres major, which is below infraspinatus. We see infraspinatus right below the spine of the scapula, teres major below that. When we talk about the muscles of the back and how they make things move, we are now talking about moving the humerus. Last week, it was all about moving the radius and the ulna. This week, it's all about moving the humerus. So when I'm talking about moving the humerus, these rules aren't entirely predictable in the ways that some of our other movements were. Translation, note card or flashcards might not be a bad idea for these. Now, when we're talking about flexion and extension, that's pretty easy for us to consider. When you flex your humerus, that pulls the humerus forward. So if I'm flexing the humerus, I'm pulling it toward the front. I'm pulling it anteriorly. And because I'm pulling it anteriorly toward the front, that means I must live on the front. The less intuitive muscle that also helps to pull things toward the front are muscles that attach on the lateral side of the humerus. So the big one we're talking about with attaching on the lateral side that helps me with flexion is the deltoid muscle. The deltoid muscle is attaching, if you remember, the triangle ends on the outside of your humerus. So the deltoid muscle helps with flexion because it lives laterally. One of these others, either latissimus, pectoralis, or teres, one of these other muscles lives on the front side of the body, the anterior side of the body. Can you tell me in the chat, is it 1, 2, or 3 that is also found on the anterior of the body? Latissimus, pectoralis, or teres major? Who lives on the front? Yeah, Lisa's right. The one of those that lives on the front is pectoralis major. That's the big muscle in your chest, the pecs. So my other muscle that helps me to pull the humerus forward is pectoralis major, because it's attaching to the humerus on the front side of the humerus. Muscles that live on the back side of the body are going to pull the humerus backwards. So that movement, pulling your humerus backwards, is extension, which means that latissimus dorsi, who lives on the back side of the body, and teres major, who also lives on the back side of the body, both of them are going to extend the humerus because they live on the back side. So big picture, flexion means moving forward. If you live on the front, you do that. Or in the special case of the deltoid, technically it attaches on the lateral side, but that helps it to pull it forward too. If you live on the back side, you extend it and pull it backwards. The other movement we're reviewing at the shoulder joint is abduction and adduction. Remember that when we're talking about an arm, when I do abduction, I move away from the midline of the body. When I do adduction, I move toward the midline of the body. Hey, did I mess up my notes here? Is my rule wrong? I feel like it might be. Can anyone confirm for me? Let me see if I have that packet somewhere. I have copy and paste trouble sometimes, so I'm checking here to see. Yes. Okay, copy and paste probs. Let's see, lateral and anterior. All right. When I am talking about abduction and adduction, if you attach to the outside, the lateral side of the humerus, you pull on the humerus and make it go up. We pull away from the midline. That's abduction. But if you live closer to the middle of the body, if we live medial, so the front or the back muscles that attach in those places, we're going to pull it back down toward the middle of the body. So when I'm looking at my muscles here, which ones would do abduction or which ones would do adduction? The only one of these muscles that attaches on the lateral aspect of the humerus is the deltoid. Because the deltoid attaches on the lateral aspect of the humerus, it does abduction. All of my other muscles that are attaching either from the front or the back, all of those are going to pull that arm back down. All of those are going to do adduction, add it back. So in the brief bit of time I've got left, I want to work with you real fast on the origins and insertions activity for latissimus dorsi. Remind me in the chat, is it the origin or the insertion that does not move when a muscle contracts? The origin or the insertion does not move when a muscle contracts. Yeah, exactly. The origin does not move when a muscle contracts. So when we talk about latissimus dorsi, it has a couple of origins. The first origins are the spines, which are the parts that stick out on several of my vertebrae. So I'm gonna draw a blue line here from the spines of several of my vertebrae. The other origin of this muscle is the iliac crest. Remember, the iliac crest is what you put your hands on your hips, iliac crest. The insertion is what I'm going to pull on, what I'm going to move toward the origin. So my insertion is something called the intertubercular sulcus. All you need to know is that that's an indentation between tubercles. So there's some bumps called tubercles. The intertubercular sulcus. Excellent. Now I'm going to connect the dots. So I've got some fibers that go down to the spine and some fibers that go down to the iliac crest. Here's my latissimus dorsi muscle. When we're considering the movements that this muscle does, consider that when we start here with our angles, consider that the origin, the non-moving site, is toward the back side of the body. Your iliac crest and your vertebrae is farther back than your humerus, than the top of your humerus. So when I pull on my origin, or when I pull my insertion, excuse me, When I pull on, let me get my pointer. When I pull on my insertion up here, this is going to pull my whole bone toward the back. This part of my bone is going to swing backwards. We're trying to get backwards. If I pull my humerus backwards, is that flexion or extension? When my humerus goes backwards, flexion or extension? Can you tell on yourself? Yeah, we're nervous. We are correct, though. When your humerus goes backwards, that is extension. Think about anatomical position when you're standing straight up. If I pull my humerus behind normal, I made the joint, my shoulder joint, get even bigger than it's supposed to. So I am increasing, in the words of my thing, I'm increasing the angle, which is a fancy word for saying I'm doing extension. Because I pull the humerus toward the back side of the body, I'm doing extension with it because my insertion was farther forward than my origin. I'm pulling it back together. The other thing I can do with latissimus dorsi is either do abduction or adduction. When we're considering if I do abduction or adduction, again, let's look back at the fact that my insertion is lateral to my origin, which means that when I contract, I'm going to pull my insertion this direction. I'm going to pull it toward the midline of the body. When I move things toward the midline of the body, is that abduction or adduction? If I go toward the midline of the body, abduction or adduction? Exactly. Yep. Kayla and Zaya are right for me. Adduction is when I pull things toward the middle of the body, and that's what's going on with latissimus dorsi. It's pulling things back toward the middle. With that, I have covered everything I'm planning to cover in our lab time together. Let me give us a moment for any last-minute questions or clarifying that you'd like to do before I split us up for our group work. No thoughts? All right, well, I have put into the chat our group work form. Remember that only one person in your group needs to fill it out, but if you all want to pull it up, you can track with them. So I'm going to split us up into our groups, and I will make sure to post that form again once we're in those groups. If you have questions, I'll be watching your chats, so I'll be happy to help you out in any way that I can. Some of my groups have 3 people, some of my groups only have 2. So be aware of that when you go in. It may be you're in a group of 2 or a group of 3. So I'm going to go ahead and open those up, and we'll get started with our group work.